The healthiest people in history never saw a doctor, never read a nutrition label, never ran a clinical trial. What they had was scripture, and scripture was handing out prescriptions. You've walked past every food on this list 100 times. Cheap, overlooked, the same aisle it's always been in. 3,000 years ago, these weren't groceries. They were medicine, given to specific people for specific reasons, long before anyone could explain why. This isn't symbolism dressed up as nutrition advice. It's nutrition advice that got mistaken for symbolism, and modern research is proving it, compound by compound. Today, 7 of these foods, and exactly how to use each one. Number 5, made an entire nation break down crying, in the middle of a miracle. Number 7, was once worth more than gold, carried across trade routes that built kingdoms, laid at the feet of a newborn king. Cancer researchers are running clinical trials on its compounds, right now. Want scripture and science delivered every week? Subscribe now. Here are 7 biblical superfoods, starting with the one an entire civilization couldn't survive without. 1. Olive oil, the pantry's hidden pharmacy. A man lies beaten, left half dead on the road to Jericho. 2 religious leaders walk past. A Samaritan stops, kneels down, treats the wound himself. Luke 10:34, names exactly what he used. Oil and wine, poured straight into the injury. That wasn't a gentle gesture. That was first-century emergency medicine. In 2005, researchers at the Monell Chemical Senses Center isolated the compound that explains why oleocanthal, an anti-inflammatory so close to ibuprofen, it blocks the exact same enzymes, COX-1 and COX-2. Matching that dose through diet alone takes half a liter of oil, so it won't replace your headache pill. But daily, over a lifetime, it compounds. The Predimed trial tracked over 7,000 high-risk people for 5 years. The heaviest olive oil users, 39% lower cardiovascular disease risk, 48% lower cardiovascular death. Here's the catch. A widely cited UC Davis study found most imported extra virgin oils fail international standards, cut with cheap seed oils, and heat kills oleocanthal fast. A bottle sitting on a shelf for months? Barely any left. Traditional use. A spoonful straight, each morning, poured over vegetables and bread, never heated, rubbed onto cuts and irritated skin, the way it was used on that road to Jericho. 2,000 years later, the oil in your kitchen is still doing exactly what it did that day. 2. Raw honey, the shelf-stable antibiotic. Jonathan's men are starving, mid-battle, bound by his father's rash oath, no food allowed. Jonathan never heard the order. He dips his staff into a honeycomb, eats, and 1 Samuel 14:27 says, his eyes brightened, instantly. That wasn't a sugar rush. That was chemistry science only recently mapped. Raw honey fights bacteria on multiple fronts. Glucose oxidase reacts with wound moisture to slowly release hydrogen peroxide, a natural antiseptic. Defensin 1, a bee-derived protein, attacks bacteria directly, and it's shown particular strength against Mr. SA, a strain that shrugs off antibiotics. The proof it works. Manuka honey, a specific New Zealand variety, is now manufactured into medical-grade wound dressings. But here's the catch. Heat kills all of it. Microwave or pasteurize honey, and glucose oxidase and Defensin 1 break down. That clear, shelf-stable bottle in most grocery stores? Chemically, it's lost most of what made it medicine. Traditional use. Raw honey straight onto cuts, burns, and wounds. A spoonful at the first sign of a sore throat. Never for infants under 1. Their immature gut can't handle a bacterium raw honey can carry. Archaeologists have found honey in Egyptian tombs, still edible after 3,000 years. Jonathan's forest never really closed. 3. Figs. The fruit that saved a dying king. King Hezekiah is dying. Isaiah's already told him to set his affairs in order. Then God grants him more time, and prescribes something oddly specific, a poultice of figs, pressed onto the boil. 2 Kings, 20 verse 7, says Hezekiah recovered. That wasn't a random remedy. Fig latex actually does what Isaiah's prescription implied. Fig latex contains phycin, a protein-dissolving enzyme. Researchers at Kazan Federal University found it clears the biofilms Staphylococcus bacteria build to shield themselves. One reason infected wounds resist antibiotics. In a diabetic mouse model, Topical fig latex sped up wound closure and boosted the tissue's own repair proteins compared to untreated wounds. Here's the catch. The phycin lives in fresh latex sap, not the dried figs on store shelves. The gut and mineral benefits carry over. The wound-healing compound doesn't. Traditional use. Fresh figs at peak ripeness, for fiber and mineral density. Dried figs for portable, shelf-stable nutrition. And the ancient poultice itself, mashed fresh fig, pressed onto a boil or abscess. A remedy that predates antibiotics by 3,000 years. Hezekiah got 15 more years. Modern medicine is only now catching up to what was in that poultice. 4. Dates. The original energy bar. The Israelites just crossed the desert of Shur. No water. Then Mara. The only water they found was too bitter to drink. Exodus 15:27 picks up from there. They reach Elim. 12 springs. 70 date palms. Finally, they rest. That wasn't just shade and water. 70 palm trees meant something specific for a people who'd nearly collapsed. Dates pack natural sugar with fiber, potassium, and magnesium, fast energy, without the crash of refined sugar. That's the basic math ancient travelers ran on. But the newer research is stranger. A meta-analysis found women eating dates in their final weeks of pregnancy showed meaningfully greater cervical dilation on admission and needed labor induction roughly 40% less often. Traditional use. 3 to 5 dates, fresh, as a fast, portable energy source. Blended into a paste, a natural sweetener in place of refined sugar. Or eaten to break a fast. Exactly why Ramadan is still traditionally broken with dates today. 70 palm trees got an exhausted nation back on its feet. A handful of dates can still do a version of that. Quick pause, because I know exactly what you're thinking. Where do you actually find the real version of any of this? Not the pasteurized honey, not the cut olive oil. The actual thing Scripture is describing. Here's the honest answer. Most of what's sold under these names, on a regular grocery shelf, barely resembles what these texts meant. For honey, look for raw and unfiltered on the label, not just pure. For olive oil, look for a harvest date and first cold pressed. A bottle with neither is probably not what you think it is. Back to the list. Because the next 3 are where this gets almost impossible to write off as coincidence. 5. Garlic, the food a nation cried for. The Israelites are eating a literal miracle every morning, manna from heaven. And still, they sit down and weep, mourning specific foods from their old life in slavery. Numbers 11:5 names them. The fish, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. Grieving over a vegetable sounds absurd, until you see what garlic actually does inside the body. Crush it or chop it, and it releases allicin, a compound with broad antimicrobial action, likely why traditional medicine across the Mediterranean and Middle East threw it at nearly everything. But the strongest clinical evidence points somewhere specific: blood pressure. A meta-analysis of 20 trials found garlic lowered systolic blood pressure by about 5 points versus placebo. In people who already had hypertension, almost double that, close to 9 points. A size that shows up in some single drug treatments. Still not a replacement for prescribed medication. Here's the catch. Allicin is unstable. It only forms when garlic is cut or crushed, and it breaks down fast once heated. A clove tossed whole into a simmering pot barely resembles, chemically, that same clove crushed raw minutes before eating. Traditional use. Crush it, let it sit a few minutes before cooking. Preserves more allicin than tossing it straight into a hot pan. Eaten raw in dressings, for maximum effect. Used in nearly every stew and preserve across the ancient Mediterranean. The Israelites wept for it in the middle of a miracle. Turns out their bodies knew something their minds hadn't caught up to yet. 6. Pomegranate. The fruit stitched into the priesthood. God gives Moses exact instructions for the high priest's robe. Pomegranates in blue, purple, and scarlet thread, stitched around the hem, alternating with small golden bells. Exodus 28:34 spells out the pattern precisely. A bell, then a pomegranate, all the way around. So every step the priest took inside the tabernacle rang. That level of detail for a piece of clothing is strange, until you see what's inside this fruit. Pomegranate's signature compound is punicolagen, a polyphenol found almost nowhere else in significant amounts. In a randomized, placebo-controlled trial, adults aged 55 to 70 took pomegranate extract for 12 weeks. Systolic blood pressure dropped. Inflammatory markers dropped. Separately, gut bacteria convert punicolagin's byproducts into urolithin A, a compound linked to improved cellular repair. Here's the catch. This research used concentrated extract or juice, not the whole fruit. Eating the actual seeds is likely a gentler version of the same effect. And one real caution: pomegranate juice can block an intestinal enzyme that metabolizes many prescription drugs, theoretically raising their blood levels. On blood thinners or blood pressure medication, mention it to your doctor before making this a daily habit. Traditional use: seeds eaten fresh, for fiber and polyphenols. Fresh pressed juice, in moderation. And the rind, usually thrown away, dried and steeped as tea. A remedy traditional healers across the Middle East used for digestive complaints long before punicolagon had a name. 200 pomegranates ringed the pillars of Solomon's temple. Whoever chose that number knew exactly what they were pointing at. 7. Frankincense, the resin once worth more than gold. Wise men follow a star to a newborn child in Bethlehem. They kneel before him. Matthew 2:11 records exactly what they lay at his feet: gold, frankincense, myrrh. 2 of those 3 gifts weren't currency. They were medicine. That wasn't a strange gift. Frankincense was, quite literally, one of the most valuable substances on earth. For at least 5,000 years, this resin, harvested by cutting boswellia trees, letting the sap dry into hardened tears, was carried across a 2,000-mile trade route through Arabia. At its height, it was worth more than gold. Rome's own gold reserves reportedly took a hit from the demand. The historian Pliny the Elder complained about exactly that. The active compounds, boswellic acids, block an enzyme called 5-lipoxygenase, the key driver behind inflammatory leukotrienes, a different pathway than ibuprofen. That's why Boswellia extracts beat placebo in a double-blind trial for knee osteoarthritis pain. Here's where it gets serious. In a 2024 Phase 1 trial at the Medical University of South Carolina, breast cancer patients took Boswellia serrata before their already scheduled surgery. Tumor cell proliferation dropped 13.8% in the treated group. It rose 54.6% in the untreated group. Statistically significant. But this matters. Roughly 20 patients. Tumor cell activity, not survival or cure. And every patient still had their surgery as planned. This is evidence Boswellia does something real inside a tumor, not a reason to replace cancer treatment with it. Traditional use: resin burned as incense, smoke inhaled for respiratory complaints, diluted resin oil rubbed on joints for pain, whole resin tears chewed like gum in parts of the Middle East and East Africa for digestive complaints. A resin once worth more than gold is still, right now, sitting inside an active cancer research lab. 7 foods. Thousands of years of practice behind every one. Somewhere along the way, in the rush towards supplements, seed oils, and shortcuts, we filed most of this away as ancient superstition, quaint stories, no real substance. Here's what I actually want you to take from this. The people who wrote these texts weren't primitive. They paid close attention to what healed and what didn't, tested it against real life, for generations, built what worked into scripture, because it mattered enough to preserve, for people they'd never meet. Olive oil calms inflammation. Honey kills bacteria that laugh at antibiotics. Figs close wounds. Dates fuel a body running on empty. Garlic protects the heart. Pomegranate does the same, from a different angle. And frankincense, the strangest of the 3 gifts, is sitting inside an active cancer research trial, right now. The book was right. It just never explained the mechanism, because the mechanism was never the point. The food was the point. The healing was the point. One honest note before you go. Information without action is just entertainment. This only works if what you actually buy is the real thing. And quality varies more than most people realize. Raw honey and the bear-shaped bottle at the grocery store, not the same substance. Cold-pressed olive oil and a bottle cut with cheap seed oil, not the same substance. Check the label. That's the difference. Which one surprised you most? Team honey, Team frankincense, or Team garlic? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Want the science behind scripture? Every week? Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Your body has been waiting on this remedy. Consider it filled. See you in the next one.